I'm Sarah, 34 years old, and last Tuesday at 3:47 p.m., my brother Marcus looked me straight in the eye and said something that made my blood run cold. "Come on, Sarah, family doesn't charge interest. You know I'm good for it." He was talking about the $200,000 he owes me. $200,000 that I worked 16-hour days to earn, money I saved every penny of for 7 years, money that was supposed to be my future, money that vanished into his failed restaurant venture like smoke in the wind. As I stood there in his marble-floored kitchen, surrounded by luxury I helped him buy, watching him sip a $300 bottle of wine, while casually dismissing my financial ruin, I realized that everything I thought I knew about family was about to change forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Millfield, Oregon, Marcus and I were thick as thieves. He was 2 years older, charming in that effortless way that made teachers forgive his missed homework, and made our parents beam with pride at every soccer game. I was the responsible one, the one who color-coded her school supplies and finished projects weeks before they were due. Our parents, David and Linda Chen, owned a small accounting firm that served local businesses throughout our county. They worked long hours, but always made time for family dinners and weekend camping trips in the Cascade Mountains. Marcus had dreams bigger than our quiet hometown could contain. Even as a teenager, he talked about opening restaurants, creating culinary empires, becoming the next celebrity chef. He had talent too, I'll give him that. While I struggled to make decent scrambled eggs, Marcus could whip up restaurant-quality meals using whatever random ingredients we had in our pantry. He'd host elaborate dinner parties for his high school friends, turning our modest dining room into something that felt sophisticated and worldly. I admired his confidence, his ability to see possibilities where others saw obstacles. When he announced during senior year that he was skipping college to attend culinary school in Portland, our parents were concerned but supportive. They believed in following your passion, even if it meant taking unconventional paths. Marcus promised he'd make them proud, that he'd build something amazing that would put Millfield on the culinary map. While Marcus pursued his culinary dreams in the big city, I took a different route. I enrolled at Oregon State University, majoring in computer science with a minor in business administration. The tech industry was exploding, and I had a natural aptitude for coding that my high school programming teacher had recognized early. I wasn't passionate about technology the way Marcus was passionate about food, but I was practical. I could see that software development offered stability, good money, and the kind of future where I wouldn't have to worry about making rent. College was where I learned the value of discipline and delayed gratification. While my roommates partied on weekends, I spent hours in the computer lab perfecting my programming skills. I took on internships every summer, building my resume and making connections in the industry. By my junior year, I had job offers from 3 different tech companies before I'd even graduated. I chose Microsoft's satellite office in Bend, Oregon, partly because it kept me close to family and partly because they offered the best starting salary. Marcus, meanwhile, was having a different kind of college experience. Culinary school was expensive, and despite working part-time at various Portland restaurants, he was accumulating significant debt. He'd call home regularly, sometimes asking for small amounts of money to cover expenses. Our parents helped when they could, but their accounting business was solid rather than lucrative. They were comfortable but not wealthy, and they had their own retirement to consider. I started helping Marcus financially during his second year of culinary school. It began innocently enough, $50 here, $100 there, money to help him buy professional-grade knives, or cover the cost of ingredients for a major project. I was working full-time by then, and living frugally in a small apartment, banking most of my salary. Helping my brother felt natural, even noble. We were family and family supported each other's dreams. After graduating from culinary school, Marcus worked his way up through Portland's restaurant scene. He started as a line cook at a trendy farm-to-table place, then moved to a higher-end establishment as a sous chef. His skills were undeniable, and he quickly gained a reputation for innovative flavor combinations and beautiful plating. Food bloggers started mentioning his dishes, and local magazines featured him in articles about rising culinary stars. But Marcus wasn't content being someone else's sous chef. He had bigger plans, grander visions that required capital he didn't have. That's when he started talking seriously about opening his own place. He'd spend hours describing his concept, an upscale casual restaurant that would showcase Pacific Northwest ingredients with Asian fusion influences, reflecting our family's mixed heritage. Our mother was Korean American, our father Chinese American, and Marcus wanted to honor both traditions while creating something entirely new. The restaurant industry is notoriously difficult, with failure rates that would terrify any rational investor. But Marcus had charm and talent, and he painted a picture of success that was hard to resist. He talked about James Beard Award nominations, cookbook deals, maybe even a television show. He showed me business plans, filled with projected revenues, and profit margins that seemed almost too good to be true. Looking back, they probably were. I was 28 and making excellent money as a senior software developer when Marcus first approached me about a serious investment. He'd found the perfect location in Portland's Pearl District, a former warehouse space that could be transformed into the restaurant of his dreams. The rent was steep, but the foot traffic was incredible, and the neighborhood was becoming a culinary destination. He needed $150,000 for the initial lease, renovation costs, equipment, and operating capital for the first 6 months. Marcus had already secured some funding from other sources, a combination of bank loans, investor commitments, and contributions from our parents, who had decided to cash in part of their retirement savings to support their son's dream. But he was still $150,000 short, and traditional lenders were hesitant to loan money to a first-time restaurant owner, even one with Marcus's credentials. The conversation took place in our parents' living room on a rainy Sunday afternoon in November. Marcus spread his business plans across the coffee table where we'd done homework as children, pointing to architectural renderings of the restaurant interior, detailed financial projections, and letters of intent from potential investors. Our parents sat on the couch, nodding encouragingly as Marcus explained his vision. "I know it's a lot of money, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice carrying that mixture of confidence and vulnerability that I'd known since we were kids. "But this isn't just about me. This is about our family, about building something lasting that we can all be proud of. When the restaurant succeeds, and it will succeed, you'll get your money back with interest, plus a percentage of the profits as a silent partner." He painted a picture of family Sunday dinners at his restaurant, of bringing our parents to awards ceremonies, of creating a legacy that would last generations. He talked about how my steady income as a software developer gave me opportunities he didn't have, how my support could be the difference between his dream becoming reality or dying on paper. I had been saving aggressively for 7 years by that point, living well below my means and investing wisely. My portfolio was worth just over $200,000, money I'd earmarked for eventually buying a house, maybe starting my own tech consulting business, or simply having the security of financial independence. The idea of risking 3/4 of my life savings on a restaurant venture should have terrified me. But Marcus was my brother, and I believed in his talent. I'd watched him create magic in kitchens since we were teenagers. I'd seen food critics rave about his dishes, watched other chefs seek his advice on flavor combinations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
If anyone could beat the odds in the restaurant business, it was Marcus. There was also the family pressure, though it was never explicitly stated. Our parents had invested their retirement savings in Marcus's dream. They believed in him completely, and their enthusiasm was infectious. When I expressed concerns about the risks involved, they gently reminded me of all the times Marcus had helped me over the years, covering for me when I broke curfew, helping me with math homework, defending me against school bullies. "Family supports family," our mother said simply. "That's who we are." So I said yes. I liquidated $150,000 from my investment accounts, money that had taken years to accumulate through careful budgeting and smart financial choices. I wrote Marcus a check that represented most of my net worth, trusting that his business plan was sound and his promises were reliable. We shook hands in our parents' living room, and I became a silent partner in what would become Fusion Pacific, Marcus's dream restaurant. The paperwork was surprisingly informal. Marcus drafted a simple promissory note outlining the terms of my investment, $150,000, to be repaid within 5 years at a 6% annual interest rate, plus a 15% stake in the restaurant's profits. He promised to provide quarterly financial updates and to involve me in major business decisions that might affect my investment. The document was notarized at our father's accounting office, witnessed by our parents, and filed away in what I assumed would be a routine business arrangement between siblings who trusted each other completely. Fusion Pacific opened 18 months later to considerable fanfare. The local food media covered the opening extensively, with Portland Monthly featuring Marcus on their cover as one of the city's most promising new restaurateurs. The restaurant was beautiful, an elegant space with exposed brick walls, Edison bulb lighting, and an open kitchen where diners could watch Marcus and his team create their innovative dishes. I attended the grand opening, feeling proud and nervous in equal measure. The place was packed with food industry professionals, local celebrities, and food enthusiasts who had been following Marcus's career. The menu was a love letter to Pacific Northwest ingredients: spot prawns with kimchi aioli, Korean spiced duck breast with huckleberry reduction, ramen bowls with house-made noodles and locally sourced vegetables. Everything seemed perfect that opening night. The food was extraordinary, the service was smooth despite the chaos of a brand new restaurant, and the reviews that followed were overwhelmingly positive. Portland's most influential food critic gave Fusion Pacific 4 stars, calling it a stunning debut that announces Marcus Chen as a major talent in our city's evolving culinary landscape. For the first year, everything appeared to be going according to plan. Marcus sent me quarterly reports showing steady revenue growth, positive customer feedback, and profit margins that met his original projections. My investment seemed secure, and I began imagining the day when I'd receive my first profit-sharing check, along with the regular repayment installments we'd agreed upon. But the restaurant business is more complex than even the most detailed business plan can anticipate. Rising food costs, staff turnover, equipment failures, and the constant pressure to innovate and maintain high standards created financial stresses that weren't immediately apparent from the quarterly reports. Marcus was working 18-hour days, trying to manage every aspect of the operation while maintaining the creative vision that had made the restaurant successful. The first sign of trouble came during year 2, when Marcus called to tell me that the quarterly payment would be delayed. A major piece of kitchen equipment had broken down, requiring an expensive replacement that had strained the restaurant's cash flow. He assured me it was a temporary setback, that revenue was still strong, and that he'd catch up on payments within a month or two. I was disappointed but not panicked. Equipment failures were the kind of unexpected expense that any business had to navigate, and Marcus had been transparent about the situation. I agreed to the delayed payment, trusting that he was managing the restaurant responsibly and that my investment remained secure. But one delayed payment became 2, then 3. Each time Marcus called with explanations that seemed reasonable in isolation: a slow winter season, unexpected health department requirements that necessitated costly kitchen modifications, the departure of a key manager who had embezzled several $1,000s before disappearing. Always, the message was the same: temporary setback, still profitable overall, payments would resume soon. Meanwhile, my own life was evolving. I had been promoted to lead developer on a major project at Microsoft, with a corresponding salary increase that improved my financial stability. I was also seriously dating someone for the first time in years, a fellow software developer named James, who shared my love of hiking and my practical approach to money management. We talked about moving in together, maybe buying a house, building the kind of stable, comfortable life that my steady income could support. But my missing investment created complications in those plans. The $150,000 that Marcus owed me represented a significant portion of what James and I would need for a down payment on the kind of house we wanted in Ben's competitive real estate market. When James asked about my financial situation as our relationship grew more serious, I found myself making excuses and deflecting questions about my assets. I didn't want to admit that I had loaned most of my savings to my brother's restaurant and wasn't sure when or if I'd see that money again. It felt like admitting I'd made a foolish decision, that I'd prioritized family loyalty over financial wisdom. James was supportive when I finally told him the truth, but I could see the concern in his eyes when he realized how much of my financial security was tied up in someone else's business venture. By the end of year 3, Marcus had stopped sending quarterly reports altogether. When I called to ask about the restaurant's financial status, he was evasive, promising to send updated information that never materialized. The few times I visited Fusion Pacific, the dining room seemed less busy than it had been during the early days, though Marcus assured me that was normal seasonal variation. I began doing my own research, checking online reviews, and trying to gauge the restaurant's health from publicly available information. The reviews were still mostly positive, but there were concerning comments about slow service, inconsistent food quality, and dishes that were no longer available. Food bloggers who had once raved about Fusion Pacific were writing about newer restaurants, their attention captured by the next wave of culinary innovators. The hospitality industry is notoriously secretive about financial details, especially when restaurants are struggling. But I started noticing signs that worried me: longer delays between courses when I dined there, a reduced staff during peak hours, cheaper ingredients substituted in dishes that had once featured premium components. Marcus himself looked exhausted, stressed in a way that went beyond the normal pressures of running a restaurant. When I confronted him directly about my missing payments, Marcus became defensive. He accused me of not understanding the restaurant business, of expecting unrealistic returns on investment, of not appreciating the sacrifices he was making to keep his dream alive. He pointed out that many investors in new restaurants waited years before seeing returns, that my expectations were unreasonable given the industry's typical timeline for profitability. "This isn't some tech stock that pays dividends every quarter," he said during one particularly heated conversation. "This is a real business with real challenges, and if you can't handle the uncertainty, maybe you shouldn't have invested in the first place." That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. For the first time, I began to question whether Marcus had been entirely honest about the restaurant's prospects from the beginning. Had he known that repaying my loan would be more difficult than his business plan suggested? Had he deliberately minimized the risks involved when he was trying to secure my investment? I also began to notice changes in Marcus's lifestyle that didn't align with his claims of financial struggle. He had moved from his modest apartment near the restaurant to a luxury condo in the Pearl District. He drove a new BMW and wore expensive clothes that suggested his personal finances were healthier than his business finances. When I asked about these apparent contradictions, he explained that maintaining a successful image was essential for a restaurateur, that investors and customers expected him to look prosperous. "Perception is reality in this business," he said. "If people think you're struggling, they stop coming. I have to invest in my personal brand to protect the restaurant's reputation." The explanation made a certain amount of sense, but it still bothered me that my brother was living luxuriously while my investment remained unpaid. I was still driving the same used Honda I'd owned for 5 years, still living in my modest apartment, still postponing major purchases, because so much of my wealth was tied up in a business that seemed increasingly unlikely to generate the returns I'd been promised. Our parents remained supportive of Marcus throughout this period, though I sensed they were beginning to have their own concerns. They had invested their retirement savings in the restaurant, and while they didn't discuss the details with me, I could tell from subtle comments that they weren't receiving the returns they had expected either. Our family gatherings became strained, with conversations carefully avoiding the topic of the restaurant's performance or our various investments in Marcus's venture. The breaking point came during year 4, when I discovered that Marcus had taken on additional investors without informing me. A mutual friend mentioned meeting someone at a party who claimed to be a silent partner in Fusion Pacific, someone I'd never heard of despite my supposed 15% stake in the business. When I confronted Marcus about this, he admitted that he'd brought in new investors to help with cash flow problems, but he claimed their investments didn't affect my stake in the restaurant. "It's all completely separate," he insisted. "Your percentage is protected. These new investors are just helping with operating expenses." But the more I investigated, the more I realized that my investment had been significantly diluted by subsequent funding rounds that Marcus had never disclosed to me. The 15% stake I thought I owned had been reduced to something closer to 5%, and even that was contingent on the restaurant achieving profitability levels that seemed increasingly unrealistic. I felt betrayed, not just financially but personally. Marcus had violated the trust that had made me willing to risk my life savings on his dream in the first place. He had treated our family relationship as a convenient source of capital rather than a partnership built on mutual respect and transparency. The brother who had once been my closest confidant had become someone I could no longer trust with basic honesty about our financial arrangement. That realization led me to consult with a lawyer about my options for recovering my investment. The attorney reviewed the promissory note Marcus and I had signed, along with the documentation from my subsequent research into the restaurant's corporate structure. Her assessment was sobering but not entirely hopeless. While Marcus had technically violated the terms of our agreement, pursuing legal action against a family member would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially destructive to relationships with other family members who still supported Marcus. "You could sue," she told me. "But even if you win, collecting on a judgment against a struggling restaurant owner can be very difficult. You might be better off trying to negotiate a settlement or modified payment plan before pursuing litigation." I decided to give Marcus one more chance to make things right before involving lawyers and courts in our family business. I requested a meeting to discuss restructuring our agreement, hoping that we could find a solution that would allow me to recover at least some of my investment while preserving our relationship. That meeting was scheduled for last Tuesday at 3:47 p.m., in the kitchen of Marcus's luxury condo. I arrived prepared with documentation of our original agreement, evidence of the missed payments, and a proposal for a modified repayment schedule that would allow Marcus to honor his obligations without destroying his business. I still hoped that we could resolve our differences amicably, that the brother I'd grown up with was still somewhere underneath the stressed, defensive business owner he'd become. But Marcus had a different agenda for our meeting. Instead of acknowledging his failures or proposing solutions, he went on the attack. He accused me of being greedy, of not understanding the sacrifices required to build a successful business, of prioritizing money over family loyalty. He claimed that my investment had been a gift rather than a loan, despite the clear documentation proving otherwise. "Family doesn't charge interest," he said, his voice carrying a tone of moral superiority that made my stomach turn. "I can't believe you're treating me like some kind of business transaction instead of your own brother." Standing in that marble-floored kitchen, surrounded by luxury that my money had helped purchase, listening to my brother reframe my financial ruin as greed, I realized that everything I thought I knew about family was wrong. Marcus wasn't the charming, talented dreamer I'd grown up admiring. He was a manipulator who had used our family bond to extract money he never intended to repay, someone who felt entitled to my life savings because we shared the same parents. As I looked into his eyes and saw not remorse but resentment, I understood that our relationship had been fundamentally changed by his betrayal. The brother who had once defended me against school bullies had become someone who was perfectly willing to financially destroy me to protect his own interests. The family loyalty I'd treasured my entire life had become a weapon used against me. That realization was devastating, but it was also clarifying. I knew what I had to do next, even though it would require me to abandon the naive faith and family bonds that had guided my decisions for 34 years. Sometimes protecting yourself means accepting that the people you love most are capable of causing the deepest wounds. Marcus thought he'd won that conversation, that his appeal to family sentiment would convince me to write off the $200,000 as a loss and pretend our business arrangement had never existed. He had no idea that I'd been preparing for this possibility for months, documenting everything, building a case that would allow me to recover what was rightfully mine regardless of his willingness to cooperate. The time for family loyalty had ended. The time for justice was about to begin. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Rebecca Martinez, the attorney who had reviewed my case months earlier. The second was to my accountant, Tom Williamson, asking him to compile every financial document related to my investment in Marcus's restaurant. The third call was to James, telling him I needed to take a few days off work to handle a family emergency. Rebecca's office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown Portland high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. I'd chosen her specifically because she specialized in business disputes between family members, understanding the unique challenges that arise when personal relationships collide with financial obligations. She was in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of direct manner that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of family betrayal. "I've been expecting your call," she said, as I settled into the leather chair across from her mahogany desk. Based on our previous conversation, I suspected this would eventually escalate beyond informal negotiations. I handed her a manila folder containing everything I'd documented over the past year. Bank statements showing my initial investment, and the complete absence of any repayments. Screenshots of text messages where Marcus promised payments that never materialized. Photos I'd taken of his luxury condo and expensive car during recent visits. Most damaging of all, corporate filings I'd discovered showing that Marcus had restructured the restaurant's ownership multiple times, diluting my stake without notification. Rebecca studied the documents methodically, occasionally making notes in the margins or asking clarifying questions about specific transactions. Her expression grew increasingly serious as she absorbed the scope of Marcus's deception. "This is worse than I initially thought," she said finally. "Your brother hasn't just failed to repay a loan, he's committed what amounts to investment fraud by misrepresenting the terms of your partnership and secretly diluting your ownership stake." She explained that while family loan disputes were common, Marcus's pattern of behavior suggested deliberate criminal intent rather than simple business failure. The undisclosed investor agreements, the lifestyle maintained while claiming financial hardship, and the restructuring of corporate ownership all pointed to someone who had never intended to honor his obligations. "We have several options," Rebecca continued, spreading a legal pad across her desk. "We can pursue civil litigation for breach of contract and fraud. We can file complaints with the State Attorney General's office regarding potential securities violations. Or we can attempt one final negotiation backed by the threat of criminal charges." I chose the combination approach. Rebecca would draft a formal demand letter giving Marcus 30 days to provide a complete accounting of the restaurant's finances and propose a realistic repayment schedule. If he failed to respond appropriately, we would simultaneously file civil litigation and criminal complaints, pursuing every available legal remedy. "I want you to understand," Rebecca warned, "that taking legal action against a family member will likely destroy any possibility of reconciliation. Once we file these papers, there's no going back to the way things were." I thought about Marcus standing in his marble kitchen, dismissing my financial ruin with casual arrogance, and felt my resolve strengthen. The relationship was already destroyed when he decided to steal my money. I'm just making it official. While Rebecca prepared the legal documents, I drove across town to Tom Williamson's accounting office. Tom had been handling my taxes for 5 years, ever since I'd started earning enough money to benefit from professional financial advice. He was a meticulous man in his 60s who approached numbers with the reverence other people reserved for religious texts. Tom had been quietly investigating Marcus's restaurant finances for weeks, using his professional connections and public records requests to piece together a picture of Fusion Pacific's true financial condition. What he'd discovered was even more disturbing than I'd anticipated. "Your brother's restaurant has been losing money almost from the beginning," Tom said, spreading financial documents across his conference table. "The early success was largely smoke and mirrors, funded by investor money rather than operational profits." According to Tom's analysis, Marcus had been using a classic Ponzi scheme structure, bringing in new investors to pay operating expenses and create the illusion of profitability. My $150,000 investment had been spent within the first 18 months, used primarily to cover losses and maintain Marcus's personal lifestyle rather than growing the business. "Look at these personal expenditures," Tom said, pointing to a series of transactions. $40,000 in rent for his condo, charged to the restaurant as executive housing. $30,000 for his BMW, categorized as a company vehicle. Even his expensive dinners at other restaurants were written off as competitive research. The numbers painted a picture of systematic theft, disguised as business expenses. Marcus had been living lavishly on investor money, while claiming his restaurant was struggling to meet basic obligations. Every dollar he'd spent on personal luxuries was money that should have been used to repay the people who'd trusted him with their savings. "There's more," Tom continued, his voice grim. "I found evidence that he's been double billing suppliers, claiming reimbursements from multiple investors for the same expenses. He's also been manipulating the books to hide cash transactions, probably to avoid paying taxes on unreported income." The scope of Marcus's financial crimes was staggering. What had started as a simple loan between siblings had evolved into evidence of fraud, tax evasion, and theft involving multiple victims. My parents' retirement savings were gone. The other investors Marcus had recruited were losing their money to fund his personal lifestyle. The employees at Fusion Pacific were working for a business that was essentially a criminal enterprise disguised as a restaurant. Tom estimated that Marcus had diverted over $400,000 from the restaurant for personal use over the past 4 years. My $150,000 represented less than half of what he'd stolen, though it was still the largest single investment he'd obtained. The other victims included our parents, several family friends, and at least 6 people I'd never heard of who had trusted Marcus with significant amounts of money. The restaurant itself is probably worthless at this point, Tom concluded. The debts exceed the assets, and the reputation has been so damaged that recovery would be nearly impossible even with competent management. Armed with this financial evidence, I returned to Rebecca's office to review the demand letter she'd prepared. The document was comprehensive and devastating, outlining Marcus's breaches of contract while demanding immediate repayment of principal and interest totaling $197,000. It also required him to provide complete financial disclosure within 10 days and to cease all personal expenditures charged to the restaurant. If he doesn't respond within 30 days, Rebecca explained, we'll file a civil lawsuit seeking treble damages under the state fraud statutes. We'll also submit criminal referrals to the district attorney's office and the Internal Revenue Service. The letter was sent via certified mail to both Marcus's personal address and the restaurant, ensuring he couldn't claim ignorance of our demands. Rebecca also sent copies to the other investors we'd identified, informing them of the evidence we'd discovered and suggesting they might want to pursue their own legal remedies. The response came faster than I'd expected. 3 days after the demand letter was delivered, Marcus called me directly, his voice tight with panic and anger. "How could you do this to me, Sarah?" he said, without preamble. "Getting lawyers involved, threatening to destroy everything I've built. I thought we were family." I found his outrage almost laughable given the circumstances. "We are family, Marcus. That's exactly why your betrayal hurts so much. Family members don't steal from each other and then act like the victims when they get caught." He tried several different approaches during that conversation, cycling through denial, anger, bargaining, and self-pity with the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed lies were finally collapsing. He claimed the financial evidence was misleading, that restaurants always showed losses in their early years, that successful expansion required investment in personal branding. When those explanations failed to convince me, he switched to emotional manipulation. He talked about our childhood together, the times he'd defended me against bullies, the sacrifices he'd made to pursue his culinary dreams. He accused me of being jealous of his success, of trying to destroy his reputation because I was bitter about my own unremarkable career. "You've always resented that I took risks while you played it safe," he said, his voice growing increasingly desperate. "Now you're trying to punish me for having the courage to follow my dreams." But the Marcus I was talking to bore no resemblance to the brother I'd grown up with. That person had been replaced by someone who felt entitled to other people's money, someone who could steal from family members and then claim moral superiority when confronted with evidence of his crimes. "Your dreams don't justify theft," I told him. "And family loyalty doesn't mean enabling criminal behavior. You had 4 years to make this right, and instead you chose to steal more money and live off other people's savings." The conversation ended with Marcus hanging up on me, but not before making vague threats about what would happen if I continued pursuing legal action. He claimed he had evidence of my own wrongdoing, though he wouldn't specify what that might be. He also suggested that involving lawyers would destroy our parents' faith in both of us, creating family drama that would devastate the people we claimed to love. Those threats only strengthened my resolve. Marcus was still trying to manipulate me, still attempting to use family relationships as weapons against accountability. He genuinely seemed to believe that he deserved special treatment because of our shared childhood, that normal rules didn't apply to him because he was pursuing entrepreneurial success. A week later, Rebecca received a response from Marcus's attorney, a downtown firm that specialized in criminal defense rather than business law. Their letter was professionally worded, but essentially dismissive, claiming that the restaurant industry's volatility made delayed returns normal, and that all investors had been adequately warned about potential risks. "This is exactly what I expected," Rebecca told me during our follow-up meeting. "They're going to claim this is a business dispute rather than criminal fraud, arguing that investment losses are an inherent risk that you accepted voluntarily. But Rebecca had anticipated this strategy, and our evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss with generic business risk arguments. The financial records clearly showed deliberate misrepresentation and theft rather than simple business failure. The undisclosed investor agreements and manipulated ownership stakes demonstrated conscious fraud rather than entrepreneurial optimism. "They're buying time," Rebecca explained, "hoping you'll get tired of fighting, or worried about family relationships and agree to settle for pennies on the dollar. But we have them dead to rights, and I think they know it." The next phase of our legal strategy involved depositions and document discovery, forcing Marcus to testify under oath about his business practices and provide complete financial records. Rebecca subpoenaed bank statements, credit card records, and corporate documents that Marcus had never intended to share with investors. The discovery process revealed even more disturbing evidence of systematic fraud. Marcus had been operating multiple bank accounts under different business names, moving money between them to obscure the trail of investor funds. He'd also been submitting false financial statements to investors while maintaining accurate books for his own use. Most shocking was evidence that Marcus had been planning his exit strategy almost from the beginning. Documents showed he'd been exploring the sale of Fusion Pacific's assets and dissolution of the corporation, which would have allowed him to walk away with whatever cash remained while leaving investors with worthless ownership stakes in a defunct company. He never intended to repay anyone, Rebecca concluded after reviewing the complete financial picture. This was always a plan to extract as much money as possible before disappearing. The criminal referrals Rebecca filed with the district attorney's office included charges of securities fraud, theft by deception, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The evidence package was over 200 pages long, documenting a pattern of criminal behavior that extended far beyond my personal losses. Meanwhile, the civil lawsuit we filed sought not only recovery of my original investment, but also punitive damages and attorney fees. Oregon law allowed treble damages in cases involving deliberate fraud, meaning Marcus could be liable for over $600,000 if we prevailed at trial. The pressure on Marcus intensified when other victims began coming forward with their own evidence of fraud. Our parents hired their own attorney after discovering that their retirement savings had been completely depleted. 3 other investors filed separate lawsuits, and the state attorney general's office opened an investigation into potential securities violations. Marcus's restaurant business began unraveling as word of the legal troubles spread through Portland's tight-knit culinary community. Food critics who had once praised Fusion Pacific began writing about the criminal charges against its owner. Suppliers demanded cash payments rather than extending credit terms. Key employees quit rather than remain associated with a business under criminal investigation. The final blow came when the state health department conducted a surprise inspection of Fusion Pacific, discovering numerous violations that suggested Marcus had been cutting corners on food safety to reduce expenses. The restaurant was temporarily closed pending correction of the violations, but Marcus lacked the capital necessary to bring the facility up to code. 2 months after Rebecca sent the initial demand letter, Marcus's attorney contacted us about settlement negotiations. The restaurant was clearly doomed, Marcus's personal assets were limited, and the criminal charges created additional pressure to resolve the civil claims quickly. "They want to settle," Rebecca told me during a conference call. "Marcus is willing to sign over his ownership stake in the restaurant, surrender his personal assets including the condo and car, and agree to a payment plan for the remaining balance. The proposed settlement would recover about 60% of my investment immediately, with the rest payable over 5 years secured by a lien against Marcus's future earnings. It wasn't everything I was owed, but it was significantly more than I'd expected to recover, given the restaurant's deteriorated condition. I was tempted to accept the settlement and move on with my life. The stress of the legal battle had been enormous, affecting my work performance and my relationship with James. Our parents were devastated by the family conflict, and I knew that prolonging the litigation would create additional emotional damage for everyone involved. But accepting a settlement felt like letting Marcus escape the full consequences of his actions. He had stolen money from family members and friends, betrayed the trust of people who loved him, and destroyed the financial security of our parents during their retirement years. A settlement that allowed him to avoid criminal prosecution seemed inadequate given the scope of his crimes. I want him to face criminal charges, I told Rebecca. This isn't just about getting my money back, it's about preventing him from doing this to other people in the future. Rebecca nodded approvingly. I hoped you'd say that. The district attorney's office has indicated they're prepared to file formal charges regardless of whether we settle the civil case. Marcus's crimes extend beyond what he did to you personally. The criminal charges were filed on a Thursday morning in late September. Marcus was arrested at his condo and taken to the county jail, where he was booked on multiple felony counts including securities fraud, theft in the first degree, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The local news media covered the arrest extensively, describing Marcus as a once promising chef whose restaurant had become the center of a complex fraud scheme. Our parents were devastated by Marcus's arrest, struggling to reconcile the son they'd raised with the criminal he'd become. They attended his arraignment, posting bail and hiring a high-profile criminal defense attorney despite their own financial losses. Their loyalty to Marcus was admirable in some ways, but it also meant they blamed me for pursuing legal action rather than accepting his theft as a family matter to be handled privately. You destroyed your own brother, our mother said during a painful phone conversation. He made mistakes, but you didn't have to involve the police. Family problems should stay within the family. I tried to explain that Marcus's crimes extended far beyond family problems, that his fraud scheme had victimized multiple people, and that allowing him to escape consequences would only enable future crimes. But our parents couldn't separate their love for Marcus from their obligation to support justice for his victims. The family division created by Marcus's crimes was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire ordeal. I'd lost not only my life savings but also the close relationship I'd enjoyed with our parents for my entire adult life. They viewed my pursuit of criminal charges as a betrayal of family loyalty, while I saw their continued support of Marcus as enabling his destructive behavior. The criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring, giving Marcus's defense team time to review the extensive evidence and prepare their case. In the meantime, the civil lawsuits proceeded toward their own resolution, with Marcus facing financial judgments that would likely follow him for the rest of his life. James stood by me throughout the legal proceedings, offering emotional support during the most difficult moments and helping me maintain perspective when the family conflict became overwhelming. His steady presence reminded me that I was building a new life based on honesty and mutual respect, values that Marcus had abandoned in pursuit of easy money and entrepreneurial fantasies. You did the right thing, James told me one evening as we reviewed settlement documents in my apartment. It took courage to hold him accountable when everyone else wanted to pretend his crimes were just business failures. As I prepared for the final phase of our legal battle, I reflected on how much my understanding of family loyalty had evolved over the past year. True loyalty meant protecting the people you love from harmful behavior, even when that behavior came from other family members. It meant choosing justice over comfort, honesty over convenience. Marcus had taught me that sharing DNA doesn't create an obligation to enable criminal behavior. Family doesn't charge interest, he'd said, but family also doesn't steal life savings and then claim moral superiority when caught. The lessons I'd learned about trust and betrayal would influence every relationship for the rest of my life. The brother I'd grown up admiring was gone, replaced by someone whose choices had destroyed multiple lives in pursuit of personal gratification. But in losing that relationship, I'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that I had the strength to stand up for justice even when it required enormous personal sacrifice. The courtroom on March 15th was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh shadows. I sat in the second row behind the prosecutor's table, watching as Marcus entered through a side door wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. The transformation from the confident restaurateur I'd once known to this defeated-looking defendant was jarring, even after everything he'd done. Marcus's trial lasted 6 days. The prosecution methodically presented evidence of his fraud scheme, calling witnesses who testified about fake financial statements, diverted investor funds, and the systematic deception that had funded his luxurious lifestyle. Tom Williamson spent an entire afternoon explaining the complex web of bank accounts and shell companies Marcus had created to hide stolen money. I testified on the 4th day, describing how Marcus had manipulated our family relationship to secure my investment and then violated every promise he'd made about repayment and transparency. The defense attorney tried to portray me as a vindictive sister seeking revenge, but the financial evidence spoke louder than any character assassination attempts. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Patricia Nguyen, a forensic accountant who had traced every dollar of investor money through Marcus's various accounts. She demonstrated that less than 30% of the funds had actually been used for legitimate restaurant expenses, while the majority had been diverted to personal use or used to pay earlier investors in classic Ponzi fashion. When Marcus took the stand in his own defense, he maintained that he'd intended to repay everyone once the restaurant achieved profitability. He claimed that the personal expenses were necessary business investments and that his failure to disclose certain transactions was due to inexperience rather than criminal intent. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor exposed numerous lies in his testimony, comparing his statements to emails and text messages that proved deliberate deception. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Marcus showed no emotion as the foreman read each verdict, but I saw our mother collapse into sobs in the gallery behind him. Our father sat stone-faced, staring straight ahead as if willing himself to be anywhere else. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, giving the defense time to present mitigation evidence while the prosecution prepared victim impact statements. Rebecca helped me write my statement, focusing on the financial devastation Marcus had caused and the destruction of family relationships that had once been the foundation of my emotional support system. At the sentencing hearing, I stood at the podium facing Marcus directly for the first time since that confrontation in his kitchen. He looked older, thinner, diminished by months of legal proceedings and the reality of his situation. When I began reading my impact statement, he maintained eye contact for the first few sentences before looking down at his hands. Marcus didn't just steal my money, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. He stole my faith in family, my sense of security, and my belief that the people closest to me would protect rather than exploit that closeness. The financial damage can eventually be repaired, but the emotional damage will last forever. Other victims also spoke, including our parents, who had lost their retirement savings but still pleaded for leniency in Marcus's sentencing. Their loyalty to him remained unshaken even after learning the full scope of his crimes, which somehow made their losses even more tragic. Judge Harrison sentenced Marcus to 4 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after serving half his sentence. He was also ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, though the judge acknowledged that recovery would likely be limited given Marcus's lack of assets. The restaurant had been sold to pay creditors, yielding barely enough to cover outstanding debts to suppliers and employees. As the bailiff led Marcus away in handcuffs, he turned back toward the gallery and mouthed, "I'm sorry," to our parents. He didn't look at me, though I'd been the one person whose support might have allowed him to avoid this outcome if he'd been honest from the beginning. The civil litigation concluded 2 months later with a settlement that recovered approximately 70% of my original investment. Marcus's condo and car were sold, his bank accounts were seized, and a garnishment order was placed against his future earnings for the remaining balance. I would probably never recover the full amount he owed me, but the financial resolution was less important than the legal vindication. James and I used the settlement money as a down payment on a house in Ben's Northwest Hills, a modest 3-bedroom craftsman with mountain views and a garden where I could grow vegetables. The house represented a fresh start, built on honest money rather than the false promises that had defined my relationship with Marcus. Our parents struggled to rebuild their retirement savings, taking part-time jobs in their 70s to supplement Social Security payments. I offered to help them financially, but they declined, apparently viewing my assistance as connected to Marcus's downfall. Their rejection hurt, but I understood that accepting my help would force them to acknowledge that I'd been right about Marcus's character. The family divide created by Marcus's crimes proved more durable than I'd hoped. Holiday gatherings became awkward affairs where we carefully avoided discussing Marcus's imprisonment or the ongoing restitution payments. Our parents visited him regularly in prison, sharing updates about his condition and his expressions of remorse, apparently hoping I would soften my position and support his eventual release. I maintained boundaries around those conversations, making it clear that while I didn't wish Marcus personal harm, I also wouldn't pretend that his crimes were merely mistakes or that family loyalty required forgiveness without accountability. He had destroyed multiple lives through deliberate criminal behavior, and the consequences he was facing were the natural result of his choices. Rebecca helped me understand that family trauma often creates permanent changes in relationships, even after legal issues are resolved. The trust Marcus had violated couldn't be rebuilt through apologies or prison time, just as the financial damage he'd caused couldn't be completely repaired through restitution payments. Some relationships don't survive betrayal of this magnitude, she told me during our final meeting. Accepting that reality is part of moving forward rather than remaining trapped in the past. I found wisdom in her words as I adapted to life without the family support system that had once seemed unshakable. James became my primary emotional anchor, along with new friendships built around shared interests rather than shared DNA. I discovered that chosen family could be more reliable than biological family when it was based on mutual respect and honest communication. My career flourished during the year following Marcus's sentencing. The skills I'd developed managing the crisis, researching complex financial transactions, coordinating with legal professionals, maintaining composure under pressure, translated into professional advancement. I was promoted to senior project manager, with responsibilities that included overseeing teams and budgets that dwarfed anything I'd managed before. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's betrayal had ultimately strengthened my professional capabilities and personal resilience. I'd learned to trust my instincts about people's motivations, to document important agreements rather than relying on verbal promises, and to prioritize my own financial security over other people's dreams. James and I married the following spring in a small ceremony in our backyard, surrounded by friends who had supported us through the difficulties of the previous 2 years. Our parents attended but sat separately from James's family, maintaining the emotional distance that had characterized our relationship since Marcus's arrest. During the reception, our father approached me privately to express regret about how our family had fractured. He acknowledged that Marcus's crimes had been inexcusable but maintained that pursuing criminal charges had caused unnecessary additional pain for everyone involved. "I understand why you did what you did," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. "But I wish we could have found another way, something that would have held Marcus accountable without destroying our family." I appreciated his effort to bridge the gap between us, but I also recognized the fundamental difference in our perspectives. He still viewed Marcus's crimes as family problems that should have been resolved privately, while I understood them as criminal behavior that required legal intervention to protect future victims. "Our family was destroyed when Marcus chose to steal from the people who loved him," I replied gently. "I didn't create that destruction by reporting his crimes, I just refused to pretend it hadn't happened." Marcus was released from prison after serving 2 years and 4 months of his sentence. I learned about his release through a victim notification system, rather than family communication, which illustrated how completely our relationships had changed. According to the notification, he was required to continue making restitution payments and report to a parole officer for the remainder of his sentence. I felt surprisingly little emotion upon learning of his release. The anger and betrayal that had consumed me during the early stages of our legal battle had been replaced by indifference. Marcus had become a stranger whose choices had taught me valuable lessons about trust and family dynamics, but whose future held no relevance to my own life. He attempted to contact me several months after his release, sending a handwritten letter to my workplace address. The letter contained expressions of remorse and requests for reconciliation, along with promises to continue making restitution payments and rebuild his life through honest work. He'd found employment as a line cook at a chain restaurant, a dramatic come-down from his former status as a celebrated chef. I read the letter once and then destroyed it without responding. Marcus's remorse, whether genuine or calculated, didn't create any obligation for me to resume our relationship. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, not because forgiveness is impossible, but because forgetting would require abandoning the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving his deception. James and I celebrated our second wedding anniversary by taking a trip to New Zealand, funded entirely by money we'd saved through careful budgeting and responsible financial planning. The contrast with my former willingness to risk everything on Marcus's promises wasn't lost on me as we explored fjords and mountains that represented adventure without recklessness. Our parents gradually accepted that the family dynamics had permanently changed, though they never stopped hoping for eventual reconciliation between Marcus and me. They shared updates about his progress in rebuilding his life, apparently believing that evidence of his reform would eventually persuade me to forgive his crimes. I developed standard responses to those updates that acknowledged their information without encouraging further discussion. Marcus's post-prison employment, his attendance at addiction counseling sessions, and his expressions of remorse were between him and them. My own healing required focusing on the future rather than relitigating the past. The final restitution payment arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 years after Marcus's release, a check for $247 that completed his court-ordered financial obligations to me. The amount was insignificant compared to the interest and opportunity costs his theft had created, but receiving it marked the formal end of our legal relationship. I deposited the check and filed the receipt with the other documents from Marcus's case, then closed that chapter of my life permanently. The money he'd stolen had been replaced through my own efforts and James's support. The trust he'd violated had been rebuilt through relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation. Looking back on the 5 years since that confrontation in Marcus's kitchen, I recognize that his betrayal taught me lessons that no amount of money could have purchased. I learned to distinguish between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. I discovered that protecting myself sometimes requires disappointing people whose approval I'd always sought. Most importantly, I realized that true security comes from my own capabilities rather than other people's promises. Marcus had said that family doesn't charge interest, apparently believing that our shared childhood created special exemptions from normal standards of honesty and accountability. But real family members don't exploit those relationships for personal gain. They don't steal life savings and then claim moral superiority when confronted with evidence of their crimes. The family I've built with James operates on principles of mutual respect and transparent communication. We make financial decisions together, support each other's goals without sacrificing our individual security, and resolve conflicts through honest conversation rather than manipulation or emotional blackmail. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd accepted Marcus's theft as a family matter to be handled privately, as our parents preferred. He would have escaped legal consequences, other victims would have received no justice, and his criminal behavior would likely have continued until someone else was willing to hold him accountable. By pursuing legal action despite family pressure to remain silent, I helped prevent Marcus from victimizing additional people while also protecting my own financial future. The choice to prioritize justice over family harmony was difficult, but it was ultimately the only decision consistent with my values and self-respect. The scars from Marcus's betrayal will probably never completely heal, but they've become sources of strength rather than weakness. I trust my instincts about people's motivations because I've seen how even beloved family members can become predators when money is involved. I document important agreements because I've learned that verbal promises are worthless when conflicts arise. Most importantly, I've learned that sometimes the most loving action is refusing to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal causes pain to people you care about. Marcus needed to face consequences for his crimes, not just for my benefit but for his own growth and the protection of future victims. Family doesn't charge interest, but family also doesn't steal, lie, and manipulate the people who love them most. Real family members earn trust through consistent actions rather than demanding it through emotional manipulation. They build each other up rather than tearing each other down for personal gain. The $200,000 Marcus stole from me was just money, ultimately replaceable through time and effort. But the lessons I learned about trust, accountability, and the true meaning of family loyalty are priceless gifts that will guide every relationship for the rest of my life. 5 years after that final restitution check arrived, I received an unexpected phone call that would test everything I'd learned about boundaries and forgiveness. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and James and I were preparing dinner in our kitchen when my phone buzzed with an unknown Portland number. "Sarah, it's Marcus." His voice was different, quieter, stripped of the confidence that had once defined him. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to tell you something important. Dad's in the hospital." My hands went still on the cutting board. Our father had suffered a massive heart attack that morning and was in intensive care at Portland General Hospital. The doctors weren't optimistic about his chances of recovery, and our mother was too distraught to make the necessary calls to extended family. Mom asked me to contact you, Marcus continued. She's been at the hospital all day and doesn't have your current number. I got it from your old boss at Microsoft. The irony of learning about our father's condition from the brother I'd cut out of my life wasn't lost on me. Despite everything that had happened between us, Marcus was still technically family, still someone who shared our parents and our history. In a crisis, those connections reasserted themselves regardless of legal battles and broken trust. James drove with me to Portland that night, neither of us speaking much during the 3-hour journey. I'd imagined this scenario countless times over the years, wondering how I would react when family tragedy inevitably forced me back into contact with Marcus. Now that it was happening, I felt surprisingly calm, focused on what needed to be done rather than relitigating old grievances. The intensive care unit was sterile and fluorescent bright, filled with the electronic beeping of life support machines. I found our mother sitting beside Dad's bed, holding his hand while tears streamed down her face. She looked older than her 74 years, worn down by years of financial stress and family conflict. "Sarah," she whispered, standing to embrace me. "I'm so glad you're here. The doctors say the next 24 hours are critical." Dad was unconscious, connected to a ventilator and multiple monitoring devices. His face was pale and drawn, making him look fragile in a way I'd never seen before. All the anger I'd carried about his continued support of Marcus seemed petty in the face of his mortality. Marcus appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, hesitating before entering the room. He'd aged noticeably since his release from prison, with gray threading through his hair and deep lines around his eyes. The expensive clothes and confident posture were gone, replaced by the humble demeanor of someone who'd lost everything and was still rebuilding. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, directing his words to both James and me. "I know this is awkward, but Dad would want us all here." We established an unspoken truce that night, taking turns sitting with Dad while the others rested in the family waiting area. Marcus and I didn't discuss our history or attempt any reconciliation, but we managed to coexist in the same space without conflict. Our focus remained entirely on Dad's condition and supporting our mother through the crisis. Dad regained consciousness on the second day, though he remained weak and disoriented. The doctors explained that he'd suffered significant heart damage and would require extensive cardiac rehabilitation if he survived. The prognosis was uncertain, but the fact that he was awake and responsive was encouraging. "Sarah," Dad's voice was barely a whisper when he saw me beside his bed. "You came." "Of course I came, Dad. I love you." He squeezed my hand with surprising strength, his eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry about everything, the fighting, the divided family. I should have handled Marcus's situation differently from the beginning." This wasn't the conversation I'd expected to have in a hospital room, but I recognized it might be our only opportunity for honest communication. Dad had never acknowledged that his continued support of Marcus had contributed to our family's dysfunction, and hearing him accept responsibility was both painful and healing. "You loved him," I said simply. "That's what parents do." I never blamed you for that. During Dad's recovery period, Marcus and I found ourselves working together to coordinate his care and support our mother. We discussed medical decisions, insurance paperwork, and practical arrangements without personal animosity, treating each other like responsible adults dealing with a family crisis. Marcus had genuinely changed during his years of legal consequences and personal rebuilding. He worked as a prep cook at a family restaurant in Southeast Portland, living in a small apartment and maintaining the humble lifestyle of someone who understood the value of honest work. He attended weekly therapy sessions and participated in a support group for people who'd committed financial crimes. "I know you'll probably never forgive me," he said one evening as we sat in the hospital cafeteria, "but I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. I needed to face consequences for what I'd done, and you were the only one strong enough to make that happen." His acknowledgement of my decision to pursue legal action was something I'd never expected to hear. For years, our parents had framed my choice as vindictive and destructive, but Marcus himself now recognized it as necessary justice. That validation meant more to me than any apology could have. "I'm glad you learned from the experience," I replied. "But you're right that forgiveness isn't something I can offer. Too much damage was done to too many people." He nodded, accepting my position without argument. I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'm different now, and I'm grateful for the lessons, even though they came at such a high cost. Dad spent 3 weeks in the hospital, followed by 2 months in cardiac rehabilitation. His recovery was slower than hoped, leaving him permanently weakened but alive and mentally sharp. The crisis had forced our family to function as a unit again, though the underlying tensions remained unresolved. As Dad's condition stabilized, I returned to my life in Bend while maintaining regular contact with our mother about his progress. Marcus continued working in Portland and visiting our parents regularly, but he respected the boundaries I'd established and didn't attempt further personal contact with me. Our mother seemed relieved that Marcus and I could coexist peacefully during family emergencies, even if we weren't rebuilding our relationship. She'd spent years hoping for full reconciliation, but she gradually accepted that civil cooperation during crises was probably the best outcome possible given our history. Dad lived for 2 more years after his heart attack, spending his final months in relative peace surrounded by family who had learned to navigate their complex dynamics with maturity. His funeral brought together relatives and friends who hadn't seen each other since before Marcus's legal troubles, creating a bittersweet reunion centered on celebrating Dad's life rather than relitigating family conflicts. Marcus and I maintained our respectful distance during the funeral proceedings, working together when necessary but avoiding personal conversations. He'd grown into someone I could respect as a fellow adult managing family responsibilities, even though I couldn't trust him as a brother or friend. After Dad's death, our mother decided to sell the family home and move to a senior living community. Marcus and I collaborated on the estate sale and property preparation, dividing tasks based on our different strengths and availability. The process was remarkably smooth, demonstrating that we'd both learned to prioritize practical needs over personal grievances. The final settlement of Dad's estate included a small inheritance for each of his children, money that Marcus immediately offered to contribute toward his remaining restitution obligations to me. I declined the gesture, explaining that his debt had been legally satisfied and that mixing inheritance matters with our past financial disputes would only create new complications. "The money you stole was between us," I told him. "This inheritance comes from Dad, and it should be used for your own financial stability." 6 months after Dad's funeral, I received a wedding invitation from Marcus. He was marrying Elena, a social worker he'd met through his therapy group. The invitation was simple and respectful, offering me the option to attend or decline without pressure or expectation. I chose not to attend, sending a polite decline along with a modest wedding gift. My absence wasn't meant as punishment, but as recognition that some relationships exist best with appropriate boundaries. I wished Marcus well in his new marriage while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for my own peace. James and I started our own family that same year, welcoming a daughter we named Grace. Becoming a parent shifted my perspective on family dynamics and forgiveness, helping me understand how love and disappointment could coexist without canceling each other out. Our mother became a devoted grandmother, visiting Bend regularly to spend time with Grace and delighting in her role as the family storyteller. She shared happy memories from Marcus's and my childhood, carefully avoiding the painful chapters that had divided us as adults. Marcus sent a congratulations card when Grace was born, along with a handmade wooden toy he'd crafted during his free time. The gift was thoughtful and appropriate, acknowledging our new family member without overstepping boundaries or creating obligations for future contact. As Grace grew older, I found myself thinking about the lessons I wanted to teach her about family relationships and personal integrity. I would teach her to value loyalty and love, while also maintaining healthy boundaries with people who might exploit those feelings. I would show her that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and that protecting yourself sometimes means disappointing people you care about. The story I'd share with Grace about Uncle Marcus wouldn't be one of simple heroes and villains, but of complex human beings who'd made choices with lasting consequences. Marcus had committed serious crimes that destroyed trust and caused lasting harm, but he'd also faced those consequences and worked to rebuild his character. My decision to pursue legal action had protected other potential victims, while teaching Marcus lessons he couldn't have learned any other way. The family conflict it created was painful but necessary, demonstrating that real love sometimes requires difficult choices rather than comfortable compromises. 10 years after that first confrontation in Marcus's kitchen, I could honestly say that his betrayal had made me stronger, wiser, and more discerning about relationships. The financial losses had been recovered through my own efforts, and the emotional wounds had healed into protective scar tissue that helped me recognize and avoid similar situations. Marcus and I would probably never be close again, but we'd found a way to coexist with dignity during family obligations. He'd learned accountability through consequences, while I'd learned that justice and compassion could coexist without contradiction. Family doesn't charge interest, Marcus had said, apparently believing that shared DNA created exemptions from normal standards of honesty. But real family members don't exploit those relationships for personal gain. They earn trust through consistent actions and accept responsibility when they fail to meet those standards. The family I'd built with James and Grace operated on principles of mutual respect and transparent communication. We would face challenges and disagreements, but we'd address them honestly rather than through manipulation or exploitation. Some relationships don't survive betrayal of the magnitude Marcus had inflicted, and accepting that reality was part of moving forward rather than remaining trapped in the past. The brother I'd grown up with was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned important lessons through painful consequences. That transformation was worth acknowledging even if it couldn't restore what had been lost. Marcus had become a better person through facing justice for his crimes, while I'd become stronger through surviving his betrayal. Sometimes the most loving thing family members can do is hold each other accountable, even when that accountability comes at enormous personal cost. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.